The Cleveland Browns, a franchise riddled with scars. A team that has never seen the Super Bowl since it first began in 1967, and since they became an expansion team in 1999, they've only been to the playoffs twice. Life hasn't been fun. Until recently. Cleveland has made some great moves in the last two offseasons, and now with a full and healthy team ahead of them, there is a chance for Cleveland to make some noise. As for fantasy football, these last two offseasons have really brought some attention to fantasy players. Now, we take a look for ourselves. How is everyone doing today? My name is Aaron, and this is the Gameday Hour. Welcome to episode 2 of the Fantasy Football Team Review. In this series, we take a look at each and every 32 NFL franchises and see what they offer for fantasy football. Here, we analyze the team's quarterback, running back, wide receiver 1 and 2, their tight end, and starting kicker. Our goal is to analyze last season and see if these players are worth drafting, and if so, when and where. Today, we analyze the Cleveland Browns.
Deshaun Watson, Cleveland Browns quarterback.
So first up on our list, we have Deshaun Watson, and Deshaun Watson, before playing 6 games last year, has been out for a year and 2/3 due to legal action he had with the Houston Texans off the field. We're not going to get into those reports in this video, but he's only played 6 games last year, so he's pretty rusty, but he's still somebody who I would really pay attention to in the draft. So let's see what he did last year. He played 6 games. He completed 99 of his passes in 170 attempts. That's 58.2%. And by the way, a lot of these stats I don't have compared to other quarterbacks because he didn't play enough, except for a few stats, which we'll get to in a second. He had 1,102 passing yards, so in 6 games, that's roughly under 200 yards per game. He had 7 touchdowns in 6 games, which is tied for 33rd, which is also tied with Kenny Pickett, who we talked about in the last episode. And he had 2 less interceptions than Kenny Pickett. He had 5 interceptions overall in those 6 games. So a 7-to-5 ratio, not great, but hey, he has more games this year to play, and maybe he'll do better. As a fact, he needs to do better if the Cleveland Browns are really going to be this hyped. And lastly, he had 96 total fantasy points when he was playing. And again, we're rating this by PPR, which is 37th among all quarterbacks. So in 6 games, he averaged 16 points on fantasy. Not great, but also not terrible. Which is going to lead us to his projections. So is he a guy I would draft? I would say yes. In fantasy football last year, I did have him on my team at the back end. It didn't help because I didn't make the playoffs. Over just a bunch of factors, but I would draft him. To me, he is a quarterback 1 or 2. I would say he is a low 1 and a high 2, depending on what strategy you're going with, whether you're more emphasizing on getting skilled players at the wide receiver and running back position first prior to quarterback, or if you're getting a quarterback in those first 3 rounds, I'd consider him a low quarterback 1, but an extremely high quarterback 2. And this is the interesting part. So I say as high as round 2, but as low as round 9. And for a quarterback 1 and a high 2, why is 9 the latest you draft him? Well, recently he has some other off-the-field warnings going on. He had 3 more cases put against him, and we're going to see how those pan out. But in my opinion, I believe those cases will be settled prior to the season, and he will play all 17 games. But that's a big what if. So in this series, there's certain players that I put warnings on, whether it's off-the-field issues or if it's injury pasts, and he is the first of any player to have these warnings put against him. So be very cautious when drafting Deshaun Watson, and just keep an eye out on those legal issues and see if you need to go with a new player, you need to have a backup option in case the worst is to come. So in review, I like Deshaun Watson. I like what he's about to do with this team. I think he's going to knock some rust off, and he's going to have a great season. But just keep an eye out on all these warnings that surround him, and be very cautious when drafting him.
Nick Chubb, Cleveland Browns running back.
So now we're going to take a look at Nick Chubb, and since I've been in this league that I'm in right now since 2019, Nick Chubb is a player that I have used the most and have drafted the most, and for good reason. I am a big fan of Nick Chubb. I am a big fan of the numbers he produces on fantasy and what he can do for the Cleveland Browns. And last year, I thought he had his greatest statistical season ever. So let's take a look. So he played all 17 games. He had 302 carries, which was third among all running backs in the NFL. He had 1,525 rushing yards, which isn't even first, but it is top three. He is third in that category. He had 12 touchdowns, which is tied for fifth, and these are all rushing touchdowns. I'm not taking a look at receiving touchdowns, even though that is something I would recommend taking a look at to see how good he is there, because there's only certain running backs that I'll actually show receiving touchdowns for, and that's if they're very well known in the receiving game. I think Nick Chubb is more ground and pound. And lastly, in fantasy, he had 269 total fantasy points in PPR, which was sixth among all running backs. So last year, if you had him on your team, you had a top 5 running back in the entire NFL. Which brings me along to the projections. Would I draft? Yes. Yes, I would draft Nick Chubb. He is a running back 1 without a doubt. I would even consider him the second best back in the league behind Christian McCaffrey. And I would draft him in round 1, at the latest, early round 2. And yes, he is highly recommended. If he's on the board and you need a running back, look no further than Nick Chubb. He doesn't have a terrible injury history. Yes, he does get injured, but he doesn't get injured for long periods of time. He's able to come back sooner than most running backs would if they got injured. And his points off the chart. Do not miss out on picking up Nick Chubb. He is somebody who I think you should really pay attention to on this Cleveland Browns roster.
Amari Cooper, Cleveland Browns wide receiver 1.
So next up we have Amari Cooper, the former Oakland Raider, the former Dallas Cowboy. So last year he had his full season with the Cleveland Browns, and mostly under Brissett and only 6 games under Deshaun Watson, but he put up some really good numbers, some wide receiver 1 numbers, some numbers that make me wish he was still with the Dallas Cowboys. So let's see. He had 17 games played, and in those 17 games he had 78 receptions, which was tied for 22nd, so nothing too big, but hey, that's still very high with receivers. He had 1,160 receiving yards. That was 12th among all receivers. He had 9 touchdowns, which was tied for 6th among all receivers. And he put up 240 total fantasy points, PPR, and that was 10th. Now, I expected him to have over 200, but not 240. I thought he had a lot of points last year. And if he is trending upwards in this direction, then Deshaun Watson has something good to be looking forward to when he plays all those 17 games. He has Amari Cooper. Hey, this is going to be fun for Deshaun Watson. With that said, I have to ask whether or not I'm to be excited when he is projected, because where would I pick him up? Because I would draft him. To me, he is a wide receiver 1 on a low wide receiver team, more a run attack, or he's a very high wide receiver 2. And I would see him being picked up in rounds 3 and 7, depending on who's gone off the board by then. But I do see his numbers trending upwards, but I also see other people's numbers trending upwards too. So I have Amari Cooper still somewhere in the 10th position. I have him as a top 15 receiver among all wide receiver 1s on the depth chart. So I'm very excited to see what he has to produce. And depending on how you draft, depending on when you get him, he could be a possible flex position, but I don't see him being much of a flex, but rather a full-time starter when he does play. So in conclusion, when it comes to Amari Cooper, I think he fits in very well with Cleveland. I do see his numbers going up with Deshaun Watson, which is why I also have Watson being picked high up, assuming he doesn't have those legal issues to follow him into this season. And I think you guys should really pay attention to Amari Cooper. Let's just hope throughout all the games he has that consistency, because one thing at Dallas I did notice is he would lack certain consistencies when he was on the road. He wouldn't play very well. But it looks like these consistencies are to return, and hopefully they stay there, because that's what the Cleveland Browns need in order to make it past the division and inside the playoffs. That's what they need.
Elijah Moore. Cleveland Browns wide receiver 2.
Elijah Moore has been in the league for 2 years, but he has not shown up as a big-time star as they were projecting him to be coming out of Ole Miss. But to be fair, he was with the New York Jets, and he was with them last year, and they didn't have Aaron Rodgers yet, so I'm going to give him a pass. But we're going to look at last year's stats that he had with the Jets and see how that's going to translate to this year potentially. So last year he played 16 games with the Jets. He had 37 receptions, which was tied for 115. He had only 446 receiving yards, that's 95th. He only had one touchdown, which was tied for 119th, and he had 83 total fantasy points for PPR. That's the least among all the players that you're going to see in this video today. But he didn't have a great quarterback throwing to him. He only had Zach Wilson. But now he's on the Jets in a trade that required him to go to Cleveland and return get draft picks, which was clearly for Aaron Rodgers, which we'll get to that later in a different video. But he is now with the Cleveland Browns. He has Deshaun Watson, and he's a secondary receiver behind Amari Cooper. His numbers will go up because he has a better passer. Which leads me to his projections. And his projections say this. Would I draft him? No, not yet. I would have to wait to see what he does under Deshaun Watson and the Cleveland Browns this year. But if you want to draft him, it'd be safe to have him as your fourth wide receiver option. I wouldn't draft him beforehand. I just think there's way better receivers prior to him. And somewhere I'd draft him in round 11 to round 16. But most of the time, I save round 16 for the kickers and the defenses. So maybe before that. Or he's just going to be a free agent coming off the bench. I just don't think that you should draft a player who hasn't necessarily proven it yet. Even if you think he is, I don't think it's a great idea to draft him now. But maybe later, if he starts to go off as he could with Deshaun Watson, then definitely pick him up from free agency and use him a few times if you need to. But yeah, I don't have much to say about Elijah Moore, so we're just going to move on to the tight end position.
David Njoku. Cleveland Browns tight end.
Next up, we have David Njoku, and throughout his time with the Cleveland Browns, he's always been an average and consistent tight end. Last year, he definitely had a pretty good year, so let's take a look at the stats that he had. First up, he played 14 games. In 14 games, he had 58 receptions, which is tied for 56th among all receivers. So this is tight end and receiver stats mixed together. This is why the number is so high. He had 628 receiving yards, which was 59th in the league. He had 4 touchdowns, not a lot of touchdowns. He was tied for 46th. But he had 136 total fantasy points for PPR, which was 12th. So I've been doing mock fantasy drafts, and he is listed as one of the top tight ends in the league, with good reason. He puts up pretty consistent numbers, and I think he'd be a reliable tight end to have on your team. Which leads me to projections. Would I draft him? I would, but as a tight end too, I just think there's a lot better options at the tight end position, and I'd see him being drafted in between round 8 and 13, and because he puts up consistent numbers, you could expect him to be a possible flex position. Even though I give flex position more to wide receivers and running backs, you could definitely use a tight end here and there, especially if they're worth it and they have good matchups in the week. So I would take a look into drafting Njoku. I would most likely want to see what tight ends are on the board at the time. Obviously, you're going to get a big name at tight end, the Travis Kelce's, the George Kittles. But when you're looking for a second one, don't be afraid to pick up Njoku. He should do the job, get the job done. Flex or off the bench.
Cade York. Cleveland Browns kicker.
Lastly, we have Cade York. Last season, Cade York was a rookie, and during his rookie year, he actually did pretty well for rookie kickers. He was 24 for 32 and made an attempted field goals. That's 75% of his field goals. However, even though he's tied for 35th, obviously there's many kickers. There's many kickers that played for a little bit, and they add up every single kicker that plays the entire year. So I want to see what his stats comparatively for 17 games among all kickers who played 17 games would be. But the thing that concerns me the most, extra point percentage. 94.6%, and it's not 100. That's 24th among all kickers. His long was 58. That's tied for 9th. So he needs to get more range on him. Get the 60s, you know. He scored 107 total points last year, which was 23rd among all kickers, and he had 115 total fantasy points for PPR. That is 22nd among all kickers in fantasy. Which then leads me to, would I draft him? The answer is no. And the reason why I say no is because that's 22nd among all kickers for fantasy. You can find a better first, and most of the time, people don't even draft a second kicker. And when they do, they're most likely not going to draft this guy if he is outside the top 20. But if you do draft him, which it's okay to draft him because that's still a pretty good option, he would be a kicker 2, most likely. And of course, kicker 2 are normally drafted in the last 2 rounds. That either moves between kicker or defense. I know some people go for wide receiver, quarterback, or running backs in the last 2 rounds, but if you're doing 2 on all ends, including wide receiver and running back, you get 4 there, then I'd see him in the round 15s and the 16s. So with Cade York, I think the thing is, like, he's a good kicker, needs to be a little more consistent. He still missed as many field goals as Chris Boswell. So he's going to have to do better in both percentages on field goals and extra points. If he can do that, then he can jump into the top 20, no problem. And that will do it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed my analysis on all 6 players for the Cleveland Browns, and I hope you're able to draft them or you don't draft them based on the information I've given you. If you like this video, please leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe, and tap that bell notification so you can see when new videos come up or when new episodes come up. And if you want to further support, go follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and the links will be in the description, or at least the names of each channel will be in the description. In the next video, we'll be talking about the Baltimore Ravens, and soon enough there will also be an side episode talking about the NBA Finals, because that's soon coming up as well. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, take care, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.